They laughed at the horse before they ever looked at the boy. It was the kind of laugh men give when they've already decided who's beneath them. Loud, easy, meant to be heard. The horse was too big, too slow, too strange. A great gray mountain of an animal with feet like dinner plates and a name so soft it made grown men snort into their coffee. They called him useless. They called the boy poorer than dirt. And for a long while, nobody in that town bothered to ask why a starving cowboy would give up his last dollar to keep a beast that couldn't run, couldn't herd, and couldn't earn. I was one of the ones who looked the other way. I want you to know that going in, because this isn't a story about a hero. It's a story about the day the whole town found out what we'd all been too proud to see, and how it took a flood, a brand buried under river mud, and one impossibly large horse to teach 100 men a truth they should have known all along. Stay with me, because the moment that horse walked into the water, everything we thought we understood about that poor cowboy turned out to be a lie we told ourselves to feel better. And the truth he was hiding, it was bigger than the horse. The first time I saw the animal, I thought somebody had hitched a horse to the front half of another horse. I keep a ledger, always have. 41 years running the feed and livery on the south end of Coyle's Bend, and every animal that's ever drunk from my trough has a line in one of my books: weight, condition, owner, the date. My wife used to say I'd write down the weather at my own funeral. So when the boy led that gray giant up the road in the spring of my 59th year, my hand went for the pencil before my mouth could even form a hello. I didn't have a column wide enough for him. The horse stood maybe 19 hands at the shoulder, and that's me being modest, because I didn't believe my own eyes the first measure. He was the color of a storm that hasn't decided what it wants to do yet, gray going to white at the muzzle, with a black mane that fell in a tangle nobody had bothered to comb. His hooves were the size of skillets. When he walked, the boardwalk in front of the mercantile trembled and old Prute's coffee jumped in its cup, and Prute looked up and started to laugh. That laugh, I still hear it. "Son," Prute called out, wiping his eyes, "you plannin' to ride that thing or move into it?" The men on the bench took it up the way men do, passing the joke down the line, each adding his own little flourish. Somebody said the horse must eat a barn a week. Somebody else said the boy ought to charge admission. A man I won't name said the animal looked like God had run out of regular horse and just kept pouring. The boy didn't say anything. That was the first thing I noticed about him, before I noticed he was half-starved, before I saw the rope holding his boot together. He didn't say anything. He just kept walking, one hand resting light on the horse's neck, and his jaw was set in that particular way a person sets it when they've heard a thing so many times it stopped landing. He was maybe 20, maybe younger and aged early by something. Dark hair under a hat that had given up being any color. And he walked past all those laughing men like a stone walks past a river, letting it go around him. He stopped at my trough. "Mister," he said, and his voice was quieter than I expected from a frame that tall, "I can pay for the water. I just need to know the price before he drinks, so I don't take more than I can cover." Now, I've heard every kind of man ask for water. I've heard the ones who demand it like it's owed. I've heard the ones who'd rather die than admit they're short. I had never, in 41 years, heard a man ask the price of water for his horse before letting him drink, so he wouldn't owe a stranger a thing he couldn't repay. I looked at the horse. The horse looked at me, and I'll tell you there was something in that animal's eye that didn't match the joke the town was making of him. A patience, a wait, like he knew something the rest of us hadn't gotten to yet. "Water's free," I said, "always has been at my trough." The boy's shoulders came down half an inch. I hadn't realized they'd been up around his ears. "Thank you," he said, and then quieter to the horse, "Go on, Sparrow." Sparrow. They'd named that mountain Sparrow. Behind me, I heard Prute lose it all over again. His name was Caleb Renner, and within a week I knew most of his story. Because in a town the size of Coyle's Bend, a man's story arrives before his second pair of boots. The Renner name wasn't new to me. I just hoped never to hear it again. 15 years back there'd been a horseman named Amos Renner who ran a small spread out past the Caldwell line, a quiet, stubborn man who bred draft stock when everybody told him the future was speed, not strength. Folks said Amos was a dreamer. Folks said worse than that after. There'd been a bad winter, a worse fever season, a deal that went sour with a man named Harlan Voss who owned half the valley and wanted the other half. Amos lost the ranch, lost his wife to the fever the same year, and then Amos Renner just disappeared from the story, drifted out. People said he died poor somewhere south. People said he drank himself stupid. People said a lot of things, and the saying of them was easier than the truth, which was that the town had watched a good man go under and decided it was kinder to call him a fool than to admit we'd let him drown. The boy was his son. The big gray was the last of Amos Renner's draft line. I learned that last part not from the boy. Caleb didn't talk about his father, but from the way the boy cared for that horse. He didn't have money for grain, so he cut grass by hand along the creek bottoms and carried it back in a sack over his own shoulders. He slept in my far stall when I let him, which I started doing and charged him nothing for, telling him he was watching the place at night so I'd worry less about thieves. He didn't believe the lie, but he took it, because it let him keep his pride. He brushed that horse every single night with a curry comb worn down to almost nothing, talking to him low the whole time, and once I crept close enough to hear what a starving man says to a horse in the dark. He was apologizing. "Sorry, it's just grass again," he was saying. "Sorry, I'll do better. I'll find work and I'll do better, I promise. You hold on for me. You're the only one left, so you hold on." I went back inside, and I didn't write anything in the ledger that night. The trouble that turned into everything else, started with the hauling contract. Coyle's Bend sat in a bowl of land where two creeks met to make the Caldwell River, and that spring the river was running fat and ugly from snowmelt up high. The town council had been arguing for a year about the old timber bridge on the North Road, the one every wagon used to reach the rail spur. It was rotted through. Voss, and yes, the same Harlan Voss, older now, fatter, still owning half of everything, held the contract to bring the new bridge timbers down from the mill. Big timbers, heavy beyond what most teams could pull through the spring mud. Voss put out word he'd pay $40 to any man whose team could haul the main span beams from the mill yard to the bridge site before the river crested. $40. To a man like Caleb Renner, $40 was a year. It was grain through winter. It was a roof that wasn't my stall. Half the teamsters in the county turned up to try. I watched a good portion of them fail right there in the mill yard, their teams of 4 and 6 straining and slipping and screaming against beams that wouldn't move more than a few feet through the muck before the wagons bogged. Voss stood on his porch with a cigar and watched men humiliate themselves for his amusement and his bridge. And then Caleb Renner walked his one horse into the yard. The laughing started before he'd even reached the wagon. $40 and the whole town watching, and here came the poor boy with his single ridiculous animal to do a job that had just beaten teams of 6. "Renner," Voss called, delighted, "you bring that monster to haul or to eat the beams." Caleb didn't answer him either. He never answered any of them. He just backed Sparrow up to the loaded wagon, and his hands were shaking. I saw that. I was close. His hands were shaking because he needed this the way a drowning man needs the next breath, and he knew exactly how many people wanted to watch him fail. He hitched the horse. He checked the harness twice. He put his hand flat on Sparrow's gray flank, and he leaned in close to the great drooping ear, and he said one word I couldn't hear. Then he stepped back, took up the line, and clicked his tongue. I want you to understand what happened next, because I was there, and even I didn't believe it. That horse didn't lunge. The failed teams had all lunged, thrown themselves against the load in panic, and pulled against each other and bogged. Sparrow leaned, slow, deliberate. He set those skillet-sized feet, dropped his great head, and put his whole storm-colored mountain of a body into the harness like he had all the time God ever made. The chains went bar tight. The wagon groaned. The mud sucked and held, and then, with a sound like the earth itself giving permission, the beam moved. It didn't stop moving. A horse that couldn't run had found the one thing he was born for. He walked that impossible load straight through the mill yard, slow and steady and unstoppable, past 40 failed teamsters and one stunned town, and Harlan Voss with his cigar gone cold in his fingers. And the laughing, somewhere in the middle of it, just quit. The only sound was that horse breathing, and the chains, and the long groan of a beam that wasn't supposed to be moving anyway. I looked at Caleb. He was crying, walking alongside that horse with the line in his hand and tears cutting clean lines through the dust on his face, not making a sound, because the thing he'd needed had finally come. He didn't know yet that it was about to be taken from him. Neither did I. Because up on the porch, Harlan Voss had stopped laughing too, but where the rest of the town's faces had gone to wonder, his had gone somewhere else. He was staring at that gray horse the way a man stares at a ghost he buried himself, and he was already setting down his cigar. Voss paid the $40. I'll give him that much. He paid it in front of everyone, because not paying would have made him smaller than the boy. But he held onto Caleb's hand a beat too long when he passed over the money, and he said, in a voice meant to sound friendly, "That's a remarkable animal, son. Where'd a renner come by a horse like that?" And I watched Caleb go very still. "He's mine," the boy said. "That's all that matters." Course he is. Voss smiled with his mouth. "I only ask because I knew your daddy. Bred fine stock, Amos did before his troubles. Be a shame if a horse like that had any confusion about who it rightly belonged to." He patted Caleb's shoulder. "Folks remember a lot of debts owed in this valley. You take care now." He walked back to his porch, and the $40 in Caleb's hand, that miracle, that whole year's salvation, I watched it turn to lead. The boy understood the threat. So did I. Voss was telling him in front of witnesses that he intended to find a way to call that horse his own. That night Caleb didn't sleep in my stall. He took Sparrow and he camped out by the creek where he could see anyone coming, and I knew it was because he decided the safest thing he owned was no longer safe under my roof. I didn't blame him, but I sat up late with my ledger and I did something I almost never do, which is I went back through 15 years of pages, hunting. Because something had been gnawing at me since the mill yard. The way Voss looked at that horse. A man doesn't look at a stranger's animal like that. He looks at it like that when he's seen it before, when he knows something about it nobody else does. I found it near midnight. A line in my own hand, dated the autumn Amos Renner lost his ranch. A. Renner, one draft stud colt, gray, Atlas, brand R bar, boarded 3 nights, paid full. Note, colt out of imported Percheron mare, papers held by owner. Renner says worth $400 to the right breeder back east. Asked me to keep it quiet. $400 in a year when most men in Coils Bend didn't see 40. Atlas? Caleb had renamed him Sparrow, a small name, a tender name, a boy's stubborn joke against a world that only valued size, but the horse Voss was staring at wasn't a curiosity. He was the single most valuable animal in the valley, and he'd been hiding in plain sight inside the joke the whole town had made of him. The papers that proved it, the imported bloodline, the worth, those had been Amos Renner's, which meant they'd vanished when Amos vanished. Unless the boy had them. I didn't sleep at all. The river crested 3 days later, and it crested wrong. There'd been more snow up high than anybody reckoned, and a warm rain came in on top of it, and the Caldwell came down out of the hills not as a rising but as a wall. I'd lived in that bowl 41 years, and I'd never heard the river make the sound it made that morning. A low, building roar that I felt in my back teeth before I understood what it was. The new bridge wasn't finished. The old one was the only crossing, And on the wrong side of that rotten old bridge that morning sat the Coils Bend schoolhouse. 11 children and the teacher, Miss Ada Pell, who'd taken them across at first light to see the high water as a lesson and gotten cut off when the lesson turned into a death. I want to tell this part plain, because there were a lot of people there and a lot of versions got told later, and I was there and I'll tell you what I saw. The water came up over the road on the schoolhouse side. The old bridge was the only way back, and the old bridge was already half gone, 2 of its center pilings sheared off, the deck buckling, the whole structure shuddering each time the current threw a tree against it. You could see the children at the far end. You could hear them. 11 of them and Miss Pell, pressed up against the railing of a bridge that was coming apart under them, and the water rising, and not one man in the crowd on our side able to do a single thing about it. Men tried. I want that said too, they tried. 2 of the teamsters went out onto the deck with a rope and got maybe a third of the way before a cottonwood the size of a wagon hit the upstream side and the whole bridge lurched and they came scrambling back white as paper. A man can be brave and still be helpless. The water was too high and too fast for any boat. The bridge wouldn't hold a team, and it was coming apart faster than anyone could think. That's when I saw the gray horse come down the road. Caleb had heard the bells. The whole valley had heard the bells. He came down through the crowd leading Sparrow, and people parted for him, not out of respect, not yet, but because a 19-hand horse makes his own room, and he stopped at the water's edge and looked at that broken bridge and those children, and I watched him do the math no man should have to do. The bridge wouldn't hold the horse's weight. Everyone could see that. But the water was maybe 5 feet deep across the flooded road on the near side of the worst break, and rising and moving fast enough to take a grown man off his feet and feed him to the river. A man couldn't wade it. A horse couldn't run it. But a horse who didn't run. A horse built like a foundation. A horse whose whole strange, enormous body was made for setting its feet against a force that wanted to move it and refusing. Caleb looked at the water. He looked at Sparrow. And I saw him understand that the only thing in the world that could maybe stand in that current was the one thing he had left to lose. Harlan Voss was in the crowd. His own granddaughter, a little thing named Sally, was on that bridge. I saw his face. For the first time in his life that man wanted something money couldn't buy, and he turned to Caleb Renner, the boy he'd threatened 3 days before, the boy whose horse he'd been scheming to steal, and Harlan Voss said the only honest words I ever heard come out of him. "Please." Caleb stripped off his rope-tied boots so he could feel the horse. He coiled the long line over his shoulder. He put his forehead against Sparrow's gray cheek, both hands flat on that great jaw, and he stayed there a long moment while the river screamed, and the bridge groaned, and the children cried out across the water. I was close enough this time to hear what he said. "Last thing," he whispered. "I know I keep asking. This is the last thing. We do this and I'll never ask you for anything again. I swear it on him. Hold on for me. Hold on, Atlas." Atlas. He knew. Of course he knew. He'd known the whole time what that horse was worth, and what the papers in his boot lining said, and what Voss was after. He'd known he was leading $400 and the last living piece of his dead father into a flood for the children of the men who'd laughed at them both. And he led him in anyway. The horse went into the water like he was walking into a memory. Slow. Those skillet feet finding the road under the flood, one and then the next, the brown water climbing his legs, his chest, the current shoving at him in great heaving slabs, and Sparrow leaned into it. The same lean. The same impossible patient refusal to be moved that had walked the beam across the mill yard. Caleb walked beside him with one hand fisted in the harness and the water to his own ribs, and twice the river took his feet out from under him, and twice that horse simply stood, a wall, an anchor, an Atlas holding up his own small sky, and let the boy pull himself back up against his side. They reached the broken span. The first child Miss Pell handed down was Sally Voss, and Caleb set her up on the gray's broad back and turned that horse around in the killing current like he was turning him in a paddock. One at a time, two when they were small enough. Back across that flood, set them in the reaching arms of the crowd, turn around, go again. 11 times. The bridge gave way entirely on the 9th crossing, just folded into the river and was gone. And there were 2 children and Miss Pell still on a shrinking island of road. And Caleb went back into water that no longer had any bridge to break its force at all. And Sparrow stood in it like the last solid thing left in the world. The 11th trip, the horse stumbled. I watched it from the bank and my heart stopped. Sparrow's hindquarters swung out into the deep channel, and for one endless second the whole gray mountain of him tilted toward the river, Miss Pell on his back, Caleb going under at his side, and that horse, that ridiculous, mocked, impossible horse, got one great foot back under himself, and then the other, and set them and held. He held. He brought them in. And when he climbed up out of the flood onto solid ground with the teacher on his back and the boy's hands still locked in his harness, his gray hide caked brown to the shoulder with river mud, his great chest heaving, 100 people who had laughed at that animal a week before stood in dead silence, and then, one by one, took off their hats. Here is the part nobody could have planned, the part that made it not just a rescue, but the thing the whole valley would tell for the rest of their lives. When they brought buckets to wash the horse down to cool him, because he was trembling and blown and white at the edges with exhaustion, the mud came off his left shoulder in sheets. And under the mud, where 15 years of dust and a boy's careful brushing had let it fade and a flood had now scoured it clean, was a brand. Arbar. Amos Renner's mark. The mark from my own ledger. The mark on a $400 colt out of an imported mare, born on a ranch a powerful man had taken from a quiet one and then watched the world forget. Harlan Voss saw it. He was standing right there, holding his granddaughter, the child this horse had carried out of the river first, and he saw that brand come clean under the water, and I watched something break apart in the man's face that I don't think had moved in 20 years. Because here is the truth that the horse revealed, the real one, the one bigger than his size, the one I'd found in my ledger at midnight, and the one Voss had spent 3 days scheming around. That horse didn't just prove what he was worth. He proved what Amos Renner had been. For 15 years this valley had told itself a comfortable story, that Amos Renner was a dreamer and a fool, that a man who bred strength when the world wanted speed had earned his ruin, that when Harlan Voss took his ranch, it was just the strong eating the weak the way the world was built to go, and that the man who'd lost it must have been weak to lose it. We told that story because the truth, that we'd watched a good and gifted man be destroyed by a greedy one and done nothing, was a story we couldn't live with. And then, on the worst morning in the history of Coyle's Bend, the thing Amos Renner had built with his own hands, and his own ruined judgment walked into a flood that beat every team and every brave man in the county, and saved 11 children, and the granddaughter of the man who destroyed him. Amos Renner hadn't been a fool. He'd bred the one animal in the valley that could do the one thing that mattered most on the one day it counted. He'd been right. He'd been right the whole time, and we'd let him die thinking he was wrong, and his son had carried the proof of it on the back of a horse he called Sparrow so the world wouldn't take it from him. Voss didn't say anything for a long time. Then he walked over to where Caleb sat in the mud beside his blown and shaking horse, the boy's arms around the great gray neck, his face buried in the wet mane, both of them too spent to stand. The whole town watched to see what the powerful man would do. He got down in the mud. Harlan Voss, who owned half the valley, got down on his knees in the floodwreck beside a poor cowboy, and he put a hand on the horse's heaving side, and his voice came out wrecked. "I knew your father," he said. "I did him a wrong. I did him a wrong a man can't make right because he's gone where I can't reach to ask it." He stopped, started again. "The ranch I took, the deeds are still in my name, but the land was always, it was always going to come back to a Renner. I just didn't know it'd take a flood to make me say it. He looked at the brand. He looked at the boy. That horse is yours, and the papers are yours, and the home place is yours, and I'll see it done legal before the water's even down. And I'll spend whatever years I've got left being grateful to the only man in this valley who'd put what he loved most into a river to save a child of mine. Caleb lifted his head. There was river water and there were tears, and you couldn't have told them apart. He didn't say anything. He never did to them. But he reached out one muddy hand and he gripped the old man's shoulder once, and that was an answer, and everyone there understood it. I'm an old man now, older than Voss was that day, older than I ever thought I'd get. The ledger I keep is a different ledger. I've filled and retired a few since. But I kept the page. The one with the line about the gray stud colt named Atlas, boarded 3 nights, paid in full, worth $400 to the right man back east. I cut it out and I keep it folded in the front of whatever book I'm using, and sometimes a young fellow boarding a horse will see me touch it and ask what it is. I tell them it's a reminder. They ask, a reminder of what? The Renner place runs draft stock again, out past the old Caldwell line. Best teams in the county come off that ranch now. People come from 3 states to buy them, and the gray line, Atlas's line, those horses are worth a sum that would have made Amos Renner laugh out loud. Caleb runs it quiet, the way his father did, and he's got children of his own now, and they say the old gray lived to be near 30, which is ancient for a horse that size, and that when he finally went the whole valley turned out, and that a hard old man who'd long since become a gentle one stood at the grave with his hat off and didn't try to hide that he was weeping. The young fellows always want to know the moral. They want me to tell them it's about the horse, about not judging a thing by its size, about how the strong and slow beat the fast and flashy, about the worth that hides under the mud. And it's about all that, but that's not what I touch the page for. I touch it because 100 of us laughed at a starving boy and his ridiculous horse, and only one of us bothered to ask the price of water before letting him drink. Because we told an easy lie about a good man for 15 years rather than carry the hard truth. Because the boy knew what that horse was worth, knew exactly, to the dollar, and let it into a flood for the children of the people who'd mocked him anyway. I don't think he did it to prove anything. I've come to believe he didn't even do it to be good. I think he did it because his father would have, and the only way left to keep a dead man alive is to do the thing he'd have done. The young fellows want a tidier ending than that. They always do. I let them go on wanting it,